Good evening and welcome everyone to the first reading of the 2019-2020 academic year in the 11th year of the Fridays at Westminster series. That just blows me away, 11 years. We actually have already hosted our first musical event a couple of weeks ago. The acoustic rock duo Cahill was in this room, filling it up with great music. Coming up next on Friday, November 15th at 7 p.m. right here in the gun room, we will welcome the novelist and essayist Lucy Ferris, who currently teaches creative writing at Trinity College in Hartford. And at this time, I would also like to acknowledge the Ford Goldfarb English Department Enrichment Fund and the McKinley Fund, without whose generous support these events simply could not happen. So, we have two student readers this evening. Our first reader, GEENA Kim, was selected by the English department last May as the winner of the BRYAN Ford Writing Prize. GEENA, as you will find out, is an accomplished writer who is equally at home writing about literature and writing personal essays. What makes this honor so significant, especially this year, is that GEENA's class, the current senior class, is absolutely loaded with excellent writers. It's unbelievable. And that will be evident to you when you hear tonight's second student reader, Daniel Pinckney, one of the stars of this year's very talented creative writing class. After GEENA and Daniel have finished reading their pieces, English teacher BRYAN TAWNEY will introduce tonight's featured reader, Steve Rushin, an incredibly versatile writer who committed himself to the writer's life when he was a mere boy growing up in Bloomington, Minnesota. But first, let's hear from GEENA Kim and Daniel Pinckney.
Thank you, Mr. CERVAS. I wrote a short personal narrative titled Double Exposure. I'm sitting on the staircase leading to the attic in my childhood home, where the sunlight from the skylight window dapples the wooden floor. It gets shadier or sunnier depending on the way the breeze shakes the trees, and the sun is bright and feels warm on my shoulders. This is where my twin brother Eugene and I used to fill our sketchbooks with our make-believe worlds of dragons and flowers at 2 every day till the day we moved. When I stand up straight, the attic feels so small, and now I'm almost eye to eye with the ceiling that once felt vertically endless. I'm there at my childhood home for my brother's photography project. Today, I'm told we're recreating a photo my mom snapped of us when we were about 4, where we're so preoccupied with coloring the triceratops the right shade of brown we don't even notice the camera. In the photo, we're holding way too many Crayolas at once, turquoise and magenta and indigo and scarlet, and drawing the most absurd things, some real, some extinct, some imaginary. It's only been about 3 months since my brother started studying photography, and you can tell from the way he holds his camera he's new to the ordeal. He fumbles with the dials and buttons for a while until he finally settles. At first I teased him, but he does look passively serious, a to-be photographer. It flips and stutters, and I could almost pry myself from the screen from the grainy background. So I try to strike a pose in which I look serious enough to convey the passage of time, but not so serious as to overdo it. His instructions are weird. We are never to be in the same frame at once. One moment, I'm gazing at the camera alone, and in another shot, Eugene is the one doing the same, again on his own. When we were little, Eugene and I were inseparable, attesting to the stereotypical telepathic connection of twins. We're 5, and we're making the most outrageous plans together. We vowed to construct our future home before the age of 15, and to venture into the world of the demigods and befriend dragons. We're 6, and we know that dragons aren't real, and our baby brother is born, and we're sitting alone in the empty living room well past bedtime, because that's all we could do to protest the arrival of a whole new person, a stranger in the family. It was like in dreams, where the big things happen so fast you never quite have enough time to think or consult anyone else's opinion. I kept waiting for my parents to come back alone, just the 2 of them, to return to us. I always assumed that if the baby was born, that'd be it. Nothing else, other than my mom's stomach being flatter, at least in the sense that I'd conceived it up until that time. I don't remember them telling me that the baby was going to change my life or anything like that, but I realized that way back when I'd come home and see the baby cocoon on the crib. It kept replaying in my mind the glowing hospital lights, the almost insectile shape of the infant. For the longest time, I refused to call him by his name, Ian, to acknowledge his humanity, so the baby he became. But my sense of my little brother grew like the way I saw the seasons change, so that from day to day I saw no change, and only rarely did I look outside and notice that something had begun before me and finished without me. Ian is with us there too today, at our childhood home. He's 13, though he hadn't been born at the time of the original, a decade-and-a-half old photograph of us when we were 4. It's strange to think about the time he was not a part of my life, when he was literally unknown and non-existent. I wonder what role Ian plays in Eugene's project other than being non-existent, but I choose not to mention it. Ian picks up the photo and says he feels excluded. He knows our childhood only through anecdotes and photographs, someone else's memory. But just for a moment, I feel like the little girl again, who wished her baby brother gone when the baby was born. It occurs to me, charitably, that there are 5 years of our lives Ian will never know. Somehow I feel childish again and competitive. After a while, though, Eugene gestures to Ian to come in front of the camera. It's his turn. I protest, and this is not a recreation, is it? I'd forgotten about that photo shoot until, just last week, Eugene gave it to me with his characteristic grin and cursory apology about its being so late. There's a sense of pride, though, in his voice and demeanor, though I really did this kind of look. The photo looks like it's straight out of a Vogue magazine, black and white and grainy, and deliberately vintage. In the photo, there are 4 people, me, Eugene, and a pair of toddlers smiling innocently at the camera. They're almost see-through, the baby twins. It's as if they're disappearing into the void, sinking deeper into my memory. It's a technique called double exposure, he explains, where the photographer layers different photos together so that all of the different components show compounded upon one another, creating some sort of time-lapse. There's a strange kind of movement in this very still photo, a bit like the way you see things underwater. My hair looks like smudged ink. Eugene sits perched between the railings. I've looked at the photo for quite some time, but it becomes as strange to me as the first time I saw it. Upon closer look, I see another figure in the corner. It's Ian. He's there too. But in the photo, he's just a fuzzy silhouette, his outline barely assuming a human form, a bit like a psychic photograph. I rest my index finger on his almost sheer forehead. When I shift my focus, he's really there in flesh. It feels weird now to see him really there. Ian's smile hardens on the black and white photo. I suspect the sort of jealousy I felt when he was born is what he feels now, looking at the photo of me and my twin, and his barely there self, and his newer, blurrier imprint. Thank you.
I'm reading a piece I wrote for my creative writing class. It was a short fiction piece to respond to a prompt to write a 1-sentence story. The title is Loneliness. Loneliness is that feeling you get when you're running alone, 4 miles pounded into the soles of your shoes, time stretching out around you, and your breath, fogging around your head in little white clouds because the air is so cold that it turns your trachea to ice with every huff, that your toes ache a little every time they flex as your foot falls against the trail, which is laced with roots and rocks, not enough to demand your full attention, but enough to focus your mind in the early November mist, a dampness that mingles with the sweat dripping down your face, just cold enough to pull the tightness of sleep from your eyes. And now that you are truly awake, you feel your mind racing to catch up with your feet. But instead of each step that pulls you forward, each thought pushes you backwards into the past, into that night when you first let yourself be wrapped in his arms, He was warm, and you thought that you wouldn't mind being tangled between his chest and the sheets the next night, and you were. Bundled in his warmth and his smell effused in your hair, down your back, across your chest, where he had pulled you closer because the night was dark, and you woke up with your breath coming in quiet gasps, only safe because he was there to hold you tighter. You remember waking up before him, watching his breath stir the fabric of the pillow until the sun splashed through the curtains, so much like the broken yolk of the fried eggs you eat most days. Unbidden, the thought of the future bloomed wildly in your mind when he stood up, hair mussed by the pillow, lazy smile hanging on the side of his face, your heart pounding in your chest between each huff, each thought scrambling and shoving its way to the front of your mind, but none beating out the one question, is this it? That it that you have been chasing ever since those nights. The reason you brought that boy back to your room last night, hunting for the feeling, and this morning you remembered that 3 days after, when you sat in the shroud at the darkest hours, curled under a blanket you wished was him, typing and erasing and retyping a message, you floated the "I like you" into the cold February air that slipped under the window and down your neck, wondering if he was thinking about you, listening to the radiator hiss next to you. The way the air hisses past your ears now, as you turn off the main trail, you find yourself stumbling over a gnarled root, pushing through the branches hanging with cobwebs that are still strung with the globed lights of early morning dew. You attempt to swallow the memories that are bubbling up now, the feelings that you had tried to recapture, bursting angrily at the surface. But the ground is slick on this trail, and your feet are moving much faster than you had anticipated. Breathing heavily, beating back the phantom pain of his touch on your shoulder, the blurred memory of his, "I don't think this is going to work," and now the sweat is coiling down your forehead and dripping into your eyes, so you stop to wipe away the tears, and in the cloying silence of the November woods, you realize this is loneliness.
Great job, guys. Who taught you in fourth form? All I made sure I did with those guys was just not make them any worse, and job done. So good job, Brian. So coming up here to introduce Steve, I kind of feel like the before picture in an advertisement for a combination weight loss platform shoe company. His advertisement might be, "Shed the weight and gain 3 inches of height when you buy our deluxe Loser No More combination." But I don't begrudge Steve his slimmer appearance nor his success. We probably all know about his outstanding career at Sports Illustrated, where he worked for 19 years, most of them as their award-winning senior writer. I consider him a master of the 800-word essay, which Steve elevated to an art form, and if you doubt me, I refer you to his poignant work, for example, Teary Thoughts on a Special Day in Boston, which he wrote in the wake of the marathon bombing. It will move you to tears and to pull your loved ones close. He gets it. And he hasn't exactly been idle since retiring from the magazine in 2007. His first novel, Pint Man, his History of Baseball, the 34-ton bat, and his 2 excellent memoirs, Stingray Afternoons and Nights in White Castle, have garnered critical acclaim and entertained hundreds of thousands of readers. I've enjoyed them all, and I heartily recommend them. And I just want to leave you with one brief anecdote that I hope pays Steve and his family a deserved compliment. So, most of you know I'm the girls' varsity basketball coach here, and Steve and his wife, Rebecca Lobo, UConn Hall of Fame, that Rebecca Lobo, they have 3 daughters, the oldest of whom is my daughter Bella's age. They have a son too. He's a fine young man, but I'm not the boys' coach, so I don't concern myself with him. And my daughter Bella, most of you know, she's 6'2" and our starting center, so you can imagine the Pavlovian amount of saliva I figuratively produce at the thought of pairing my tall daughter with the Russians' tall daughters for the next several years. So of course I invited them several times to come take a look at Westminster, visit our admissions office, take a catalog, just think about it, please, but to no avail, and that's okay, no hard feelings. What I'm most glad about, though, is that what I told Rebecca and Steve, and I think the 47th email I sent them, was that even if their kids were 5-footers instead of 6-footers and did something, really silly in the winter, like, swam or played squash, I would still want them to send their kids to Westminster, because Rebecca and Steve are smart, kind, funny, and above all, loving and dedicated parents who bring a measure of goodness wherever they go. And I think you can see that in all of Steve's writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, our first Friday night reader of the year, here for the 3rd time, is Minnesota Nice, a lover of words and sports, an excellent writer of essays, fiction, and biography, and above all else, just a really good person, Steve Rushin.
Thank you, Brian. That was literally too kind. Can everybody hear me? That nice 14-year-old daughter that you described, I mentioned this to the creative writing class this afternoon, and was I ever impressed with both that class and Daniel and GEENA tonight? I mean, I would not have had the courage to stand up here in high school. I may not have the courage and confidence to do it tonight. But that 14-year-old daughter you described, a couple of years ago, I asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. We may have even been thinking about high school at that time. And she thought about it genuinely, sincerely, and she said, I don't want to be anything when I grow up. And I said, well, you've got to be something. Everybody's something when they grow up. And she said, yeah, but Dad, you're not anything, and I want to be like you. And I get it. I sit around on my laptop all day, and our youngest daughter, who's 8, actually said to me, Dad, are you in there writing Stingray Afternoons? And I said, no, Rose, that book came out a year ago. I'm doing something else. And she said, but don't you have to keep writing it in case bookstores run out? And then I realized that she thought I just keep writing the same. And many people might accuse me of doing that, since I've got 2 books about growing up in Bloomington, Minnesota. But I did recognize today and tonight that writing is something. It is a noble occupation, and what you two read gives me confidence that it will continue to be, in fact, more noble and dignified than I'm going to prove tonight. This is a memoir, Nights in White Castle, about being in high school, college, and then leaving home for good in the 1980s in my case. I turned 13 in 1980, and I turned 22 in 1990. We're at the end of the 80s, so for me, it was those years when you sort of are becoming who you're going to be. Stingray Afternoons is a memoir of that innocent part of childhood, age 3 to age 13, for me coincided with the 1970s, so it's also kind of a groovy history of the 70s. But Nights in White Castle was our hangout as kids in Bloomington, and this is kind of what a lot of you are experiencing now in another century, in figuring out, what you want to do, where you want to be, who you want to be, what kind of person you're going to become. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction to give you a sense of what we're talking about. And the book itself opened in 1984. I was a high school senior, class of 1984. We were required to read George Orwell's 1984. In 1984, I stole my copy. I still have it. I showed the Signet Classic paperback to the students today, just to let them know that whatever you're required to read in high school, some of it may stick with you, and you may even not only retain that knowledge, but retain the actual stolen copy 35 years later. But the only 1984 that any of us cared about at Kennedy High School in Bloomington was Van Halen's album by the same name, with the MTV heavy rotation classic Jump. 1984 also was when we got cable in the Southbrook subdivision in Bloomington. So you can imagine what glorious year this was. And not only that, but I was growing up in suburban Minneapolis when Prince released Purple Rain, the movie, and the album was the biggest rock star in the world. So I really did feel like I was living in the center of the universe. And, but here's the introduction. On a bright spring day in his senior year of high school, my brother Jim and his buddy Fluff persuaded the manager of our local White Castle to lend them 2 steel blue smocks and paper hats of the kind worn by White Castle kitchen personnel everywhere. Jim put on matching pants and Dad's white belt and loafers and arrived that evening in period resplendence at Schulze's house for the costume party that would live in lore among the Lincoln class of 1979. Now my oldest brother was 5 years older. I was one of 5 kids. He was my hero. He ended up playing college hockey at Providence. So I was, in 8th grade, 7th grade when he was a senior. Jim and Fluff left the party early at 11 o'clock. Their night ended as nights often did in Bloomington, Minnesota, at White Castle on Lindale Avenue, where Jim and Fluff introduced themselves to the night manager as his newest employees, hired that very afternoon. They were assigned to the stainless steel steam grill where the restaurant's famous 5-hole hamburgers were loaded onto square buns. It didn't bother anyone, Jim would say later, that we were completely hammered. 30 minutes after Jim and Fluff punched in, Schulze and the rest of the party turned up at the castle, 100 Lincoln Bears ravenous for gut bombs and roach burgers. White Castle hamburgers are known by 24 other pejoratives, but my brother refused to serve anyone who used them. He insisted on decorum and brandished a stainless steel burger flipping implement at any patron who, literally or metaphorically, stepped out of line. As that line grew, Jim frantically filled paper sacks with cheeseburgers and fries and handed them over the counter to his friends and classmates, bypassing the White Castle cashiers. And Michael Service told me tonight that he keeps the door locked downstairs because there's free food downstairs in that reception room. So I know all about high school kids and free food and sports writers and free food. As that line grew, Jim frantically filled paper sacks, bypassing the cashier. When the night manager realized what he was witnessing, a meticulously planned hamburger heist, an inside job, he shouted at Barney, the castle rent-a-cop, to chase Jim, Fluff, Schulze, and the rest of the Lincoln seniors off the premises. At the time, Charlie Pride had a hit on the radio that went, "Burgers and fries and cherry pies." It was simple and good back then. And while Pride was singing of a vanished 1950s drive-in culture, our White Castle remained, as the 1970s turned into the 80s, a backdrop for our burgeoning dreams. White Castle was a halfway house for adolescents as they moved from child to teen to young adult, in that brief period when life resembles a classroom evolution poster. The child rising from his Schwinn Stingray bike, now walking upright with his car keys in hand, now striding away from home holding a suitcase. My graduation present was a soft-sided bronze, like butterscotch color suitcase. My parents were telling me, get the hell out of the house. And they insisted I go to college 5 hours away from Minneapolis, which I did. The question I got most often as a child in the 1970s was, what do you want to be when you grow up? My answers varied along the usual lines of fantasy: fireman, Vikings wide receiver, author. But the question also could be taken at face value. What do you want to be? As in, how do you want to live? Where do you want to live? What kind of person will you become? For me, that becoming happened in the 1980s, between the ages of 13 and 22. For 45 minutes on that spring night in 1979, with an endless string of nights laid out before them like runway lights, Jim and Fluff play acted as workers at White Castle. But their complementary futures had already taken shape. Jim would play ice hockey in college, while Fluff would study dentistry, the symbiotic pursuits of best friends. And in fact, Fluff is now a dentist. I was in 7th grade in 1979, and what I wanted to become was Jim, high school athlete, unflappable prankster, cinematic tough guy. For many years, without provocation, Jim made a highly specific threat to his 3 brothers. I will rip your lips off. It wasn't until he left home for good, and I was in high school myself, frequenting the castle on weekend nights, that I could pass his former bedroom door without clamping my lips together in self-protection. When the 5 Rushin children were still under one roof, we gathered on rare occasions at the kitchen table and played Milton Bradley's The Game of Life. As in actual life, The Game of Life encouraged participants to attend college, get a job, fall in love, amass a fortune, and have children in the form of pink or blue plastic pegs that plugged into little plastic cars. Those cars sometimes crashed, triggering hospital bills and higher insurance premiums. Luckier players got stock dividends or identical twins. Life, and for all I knew, real life, was a zero-sum game. It could only end at one of 2 places: Millionaire Acres or the Poor Farm. At the center of the board was a wheel of fortune. I would sometimes spin it as a solitary pursuit, just to see what number came up. This book is set during that quicksilver time, high school, college, and leaving home forever, when the great wheel is still spinning, and, for a moment at least, everything in life remains possible. So, I grew up, as I say repeatedly, in Bloomington, Minnesota, and White Castle on Lyndale Avenue, the center of Bloomington, was the high school hangout. It was across the street from a bar called David Fong's, which is still there, a Chinese restaurant and bar. It was next door to, on one side, the Lindell Lanes Bowling Alley, and on the other side, Beanie's video game arcade. Some of you may be old enough to know what those were, where you put the quarters on your game of Frogger to claim the next game. And so, naturally, this was a place that we wanted to hang out and people watch and kind of, just look at life go by. We were too young to go into, the kind of restaurants and clubs where our parents would come home with the matchbooks with those names of those places on it. But there was a series of these places along 494, the ring road around the Twin Cities. And it's called the 494 Strip. It still is, by the airport and what is now the Mall of America. And we would just cruise up and down the strip in my buddy's dad's powder blue Bonneville Brougham, listening to like easy listening jazz and early rap, Sugar Hill Gang and stuff like that, and just imagined ourselves to be in the center of the universe, because what other place in the world has a strip? There's the Las Vegas Strip, there's the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, there's the Gaza Strip was always in the news, and then there was the 494 Strip. So we naturally figured ourselves at the center of the world. And the Minnesota Vikings and Minnesota Twins and the Minnesota North Stars in the NHL all played in Bloomington at the time. There was something called the Carlton Celebrity Room, a dinner theater where people would come in from all over every area of entertainment. Stand-up comedy, I saw Kool and the Gang perform there instead of going to a high school dance. And Rodney Dangerfield, who was in Caddyshack, first R-rated movie that I snuck into it at Valley West Theater. And he was on the Tonight Show talking to Johnny Carson. 20 million viewers a night, saying, plugging his next gig. I'm going to be in Bloomington, Minnesota, performing at the Carlton Celebrity Room. And Johnny would laugh and say, Bloomington, Minnesota, where's that? And Rodney would say, I don't know, but I think my act's going to be reviewed in Field and Stream. And we loved it. Howard Cosell would mention on Monday Night Football, the Vikings highlights in Bloomington, Minnesota. And I hope anyway, that most of us, wherever it is that we grew up, imagined ourselves in that place to be at the center of the world. And it's funny because I know a guy, one of the Minnesota Twins radio announcers now, who grew up in Montana but went to Hotchkiss. And I had mentioned to him that I did a book event in Salisbury near Hotchkiss. And I said, I was driving and kept driving through snow. I was like, where is this place? Where am I going to get to this place? This place is in the middle of nowhere. And he said, we felt the same way when we would drive to Westminster to play sports when we got on the bus. And it just shows you, that wherever you are, that's the center of the world. So, and the Met Center Arena, where the Minnesota North Stars played hockey, was also where a lot of concerts, the big rock concerts, would be held. And I was a popcorn vendor for North Stars games and whatever concerts were there. But I was also a writer, incredibly withdrawn, introverted. The only way I could express my thoughts was to write them down. Again, I could never have done a reading like this in high school. It's so much so that I would just walk around the arena without shouting popcorn. I would hope that people would come to me and ask for popcorn. It said like $1.50 or whatever was on my visor, and I thought that was enough. I literally had a price on my head, and I would walk around, and people would usually just tell me to move, but I was walking the arena hockey game. So one night, my boss there, supervisor, said, you've got to start, selling the popcorn. You've got to go around shouting popcorn. And I finally worked up the courage to do that during a Kenny Rogers concert. And unfortunately, I developed sort of a Brooklyn accented patter, like 1940s Bugs Bunny, popcorn, get your popcorn here. Unfortunately, I first started shouting that just as Kenny was segueing into his soft ballad, Lady, knight in shining armor, shut up, we can't hear Kenny! And so I was humiliated, and I couldn't get my patter out again. So, and that extended to almost every area of my life. And I'm going to read one more passage here, and I'm going to check the time so I don't go over here. But I was just inert. To this day, my wife will tell you, if we have to call for a pizza, if we have to call for a plumber, if we have to do anything, I do not want to make that phone call. And it's a real occupational hazard when you're a journalist and you have to call up important people or famous people's people and introduce yourself, or just walk up to some superstar athlete at his locker and, excuse me, Mr. LeBron James, can I have a minute? But that's the perverse sort of nature of this job. So, I'm going to read, let me just find my place here. This is a sort of starts out showing my inertia. Mom and Dad know I'm inert. 6 months after my 16th birthday, Mom asked me, don't you want to get a driver's license? I guess, I said. You guess? I can't chauffeur you for the rest of your life. When the driver's ed instructor picked me up in a car for my first lesson, he asked me how many times I had driven before. A rough estimate, he said, just a round number, ballpark it for me. I told him I'd never driven in my life. Tom, my brother Tom, a year older by contrast, had logged at least 100 illicit miles before he was 16. At 14, his buddy Dwight would take his father's station wagon, the chuck wagon, and mow down garbage cans. Their steel lids would crash like cymbals. Tom and Dwight knew the garbage pickup days in various neighborhoods like other kids knew their baseball statistics. When John, my youngest brother, is 14, Mom and Dad will go to the movies one night while their youngest child plows over a neighbor's mailbox after taking Dad's car for a spin in a snowstorm. In fact, they came home that night. John wasn't there, but there was a message on their answering machine to call the Bloomington Police Department. They went and found him there. But not me. I reminded the instructor that driving without a license is illegal. That would likely go down on my permanent record, which was something that I was really terrified about having when I was a kid. The permanent record. Getting in trouble and having a permanent record were two things that hung over my head, still to this day. The driver's ed instructor looked me in the face to see if I was serious, then gripped his clipboard with both hands and gently slapped it against his forehead in our driveway. And so began my 6 required hours of behind-the-wheel instruction, driving 15 miles an hour below the speed limit, popping the trunk when trying to activate the windshield wipers, activating the windshield wipers when trying to signal a turn, and signaling every turn a quarter of a mile in advance. My teacher didn't care for the way I ignored his instructions to merge onto Interstate 35W while building slowly to 55 miles an hour, choosing instead to lock up the brakes at the end of the on-ramp in a panicky homage to my mom, who often does the same thing, necessitating a 0 to 65 merge ahead of an onrushing semi. My death grip on the 10 and 2 positions of the steering wheel was often supplemented by the instructor's hands on the same wheel, so that we made our way around Bloomington wrestling for control in the 10 and 2 and 9 and 1 positions. After 360 harrowing minutes parceled out over many weeks, I was awarded my diploma from the Essie School of Driving. After more weeks watching Mom or Dad pump invisible brakes in the shotgun seat of the Honda while I squired them about town with my paper learner's permit, I took my road test on a closed course and got an early insight into DMV inefficiency. Despite failing to parallel park, if those cones were real cars, you'd have 2 separate insurance claims. And blowing one stop sign, that's what's known as a rolling stop, he said. I was awarded a Minnesota driver's license. It becomes the third thing, along with my Hennepin County library card and a YMCA membership card that identifies me as Hernando Gomez, to go in my blue nylon wallet with a Velcro seal. Now, I should explain that the Y, where we would play pickup basketball at lunch, we would go in and say, we weren't members, we would say we lost our membership card, and the geniuses there would pull out a shoebox full of lost membership cards and say, find yours. And we would just take whichever one had the latest expiration date. And speaking of my nylon wallet with the Velcro seal, when this book came out, my wife got me a little miniature bike she had found somewhere. And when this current one came out, she got me a Vans Velcro wallet with the checkerboard. So not expensive, but they're period accurate. So a month after I received my license, Mom and Dad flew to Monte Carlo on a sales incentive trip for 3M, where my dad worked. On returning, they asked me to pick them up at the airport. But when I approached the curb outside Arrivals, where Mom and Dad stood tanned and smiling, suitcases at their sides, I also saw a traffic cop instructing the idling cars at the curb to move along. In preemptive obedience to the law, I passed Mom and Dad by and made another 10-minute loop at the Lindbergh terminal at NSP Airport. When I approached the second time, I saw the same cop and the same parents. This time, Mom and Dad weren't smiling. Dad was gesturing wildly for me to pull over, but I powered past him in a panic, beginning another 10-minute circumnavigation of the airport. The third time I approached, Dad was standing in traffic with both suitcases, defying me to run him over. "What in the hell is the matter with you?" he said by way of greeting. It was a rhetorical question, but I answered anyway. "I don't know." And I wish I could say that this was, an anomaly. But first of all, it's a story that has lived in infamy in our family. And my dad, even now, when I have to pick him up, say at Bradley, if he's flying in, he reminds me, don't do the But it's also the whole bit about me learning to drive is not even a one-off, because at the end of this book, I graduate from college and move off to New York City on a 3-month temporary job as a fact checker at Sports Illustrated, which becomes 9 more months, which becomes a full-time job, which eventually becomes a writing job. And as Bryan mentioned, I left the magazine full-time in 2007, but have continued to write for the magazine until as recently as last week, and will continue to do so 32 years after I had my first byline. So I never really left, but that first job was in New York, and I lived in New York, not continuously, but off and on for 10 years, and never had a car all the time I was there. So when I got married in 2003 and moved up to Connecticut, I needed to get a car. And I wanted a Mini Cooper. I thought that was a cool car. Probably not the right size for me, but when I went to the dealership to look at them, I said I wanted an automatic Mini, and the guy looked at me like, "Come on, automatic, a guy like you should be driving a manual transmission," and I can barely drive anything, much less a stick. And I said, "I've never driven before." He said, "We only sell about 10% of the automatic transmissions. Get the manual." We went into the parking lot down by the old Highlight place in Hartford, and I lurched around in the parking lot. I said, "Sure, I'll take it." And as a result, my wife, who learned to drive on a stick, took me to the parking lot at Granby High School, where she learned to drive, where her dad taught her to drive, and my wife then taught me how to drive a stick in the parking lot of the high school. So it's as sad as it sounds. And imagine, as people didn't have to imagine, because you'd pull up to places and the two of us, 13 feet, married couple, would get out of it like a clown car. And her brother and my brother-in-law would occasionally drive it because he liked the car. He's 6'11", so you can imagine he's got the seat all the way back, and he looked like a guy in a canoe with it. So anyway, that's my life, and my wife now has the 4 kids. They're driving to Cape Cod for the weekend. I will join them sometime tomorrow. So I'm happy to have a brief break from them. She's been traveling a lot, and I'm happy to be just out of the house as a writer. I don't ordinarily put on a blazer and dress shoes to write, but it makes me feel like a writer when I'm out here doing this kind of thing. So I don't know how we are for time, but if we have 5 minutes for questions, Michael, are we good on time, or do you want to?
We're great on time. If you have 5 minutes more out of the book.
Oh, sure, I can read. Yeah, I hadn't vetted the next bit, but I'll continue to read. The driver's license is one more object on a scavenger hunt. Contact lenses, braces, deodorant, confirmation certificate, 8th grade diploma, driver's license. The prize at the end of all this is adulthood. In 8 months, I'll turn 18, and by law, I go to the post office to register for selective service, in case the Army reinstates the draft, which is Dad's dream. Uncle Sam straightened me out, he says, taught me discipline, the importance of a made bed, how to shine my shoes. 6 weeks after my 18th birthday, I'll vote in the presidential election. This is 1984. Reagan will win every state but my own. Further proof of Minnesota exceptionalism. Again, we were the center of the world, and why would Minnesota? I think the electoral votes in that election, Mondale got 3. He kicked a field goal at the buzzer to get on the board. So shaving is another rite of passage. In 8th grade, Jim said to me, "Nice stash. You gonna shave or let the cat lick it off?" One Saturday morning, Dad turned on the hot tap in the upstairs bathroom, showed me how to cup my hands like a supplicant, filled them with hot water, and dipped my face into my raised palms as if bobbing for apples. He dispensed a dollop of foamy on my fingertips. I swiped it across my upper lip, and after 7 downward scrapes with a single blade disposable shick, I had shaved. At Dad's instruction, I applied bits of toilet paper to staunch the bleeding where I cut myself. A stinging splash of skin bracer numbed my upper lip. It felt rubberized. I could still feel the burn at the bus stop. Like the party spokesman on the two-way telescreen in Orwell's 1984, I now had, quote, skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades in the cold of winter. There's enough hair on the back of my hands now that my friend Dan Olson greets me the way Paul Lind once greeted Herman Munster. Instead of shaking my hand, he pets it and says, "Oh, you brought your doggy." We have 100 similar inside rituals, my friends and I, many of them dating back to kindergarten. But this one is literally a secret handshake. Every time I see Oli, I extend my hand for petting. Likewise, we attract our hands into our sleeves before shaking hands with Danny Keene, universally known as Gator. At lunch, Oli will put his right hand in a Ziploc sandwich bag before offering his hand for shaking. In 8th grade, at Nativity, our Catholic grade school, we removed a ski glove from a coat pocket at the handshake of peace during Mass. Gator's skin is no longer excessively dry, if it ever even was, but our nicknames are built from the smallest physical traits and tics. Some are obvious corruptions of the person's name. There's a kid in our grade, and this is true, named Bill Foles, F-O-L-Z, who we inevitably call the Wallet. But most of our nicknames are subtler. I have difficulty remembering names and call most people Man as a standard. Hey Rush. Hey man. As a result, my grade school handle of Rush has given way to my high school nickname of Man. Even Dad has picked up my propensity for the word and will sometimes use it against me in a kind of parental jujitsu. Hey man, he'll say in a beatnik voice 25 years out of date. Get your shoes off the ottoman, man. And bring me this TV schedule, man, because I'm not watching this guy play guitar in a leotard anymore, man. Now that guy would have been David Lee Roth in Van Halen's Jump video, but the real MTV kind of iconic image from that summer of 1984 was in the spring of that year, my high school basketball team went to the Minnesota State High School Tournament. We played the quarterfinal games at the University of Minnesota's Williams Arena, which was a thrill because I would go to games there when I was younger and always wanted to play on that floor where the floor is raised and the benches are below the floor level. And we made it to the semifinals, lost in the semifinals, but the semifinals and finals were in the St. Paul Civic Center. And 2 months, where we would go to professional wrestling when we were kids. And my brother, Tom, when we were in high school, my brother Tom, a year older than I, wrestling was Friday night. They would air those wrestling matches Sunday morning on Channel 9. And my brother Tom would go, and a couple of his buddies would smuggle in eggs, or at one time a potato, and lob them into the ring, and then try to see if on Sunday morning when we would get back from Mass, if they could see any of their eggs hitting, Jesse the Body Ventura, who would go on to become governor of Minnesota. And in fact, I mentioned this to Jesse once, and when he was the governor of Minnesota, I played golf with him, and he said, when I was wrestling, 2 years when I was wrestling, I hurt my back, and to make ends meet, I would be the stage security at concerts at Met Center. Just to finish the St. Paul Civic Center, that summer, Bruce Springsteen played a concert there and played Dancing in the Dark twice. And both times he pulled this actress out of the crowd. We all thought she was a Minnesota girl. She was Courtney Cox, who would go on to Friends from Alabama. And then he danced with her, and director Brian De Palma, the famous movie director, was shooting this, and that became Bruce's Dancing in the Dark video. Kids YouTube it. It was like a big deal in 1984 when Bruce had Born in the USA out. But we would watch that and say, there's Bruce, and later Courtney Cox at the St. Paul Civic Center, where I played basketball. I played there, Bob Dylan played there, Prince played there, Bruce played there, and I played there, So that was a cool thing. But to get back to Jesse, he said, I got hurt in 78 and 81, and to make ends meet, I was concert security on the stage. And the Rolling Stones played the Met Center both of those years. And I was the guy on stage in the yellow shirt with security on the back. And if anybody tried to rush Mick Jagger, I'd throw him off the stage. And now fast forward 25 years when I'm interviewing, playing golf with him, and he's the governor of Minnesota. And he says, in 2002 or whatever it was, the Rolling Stones played St. Paul XL Energy Center, which is where the Minnesota Wild play hockey. It's where the St. Paul Civic Center used to be. He tore that down, built this new arena. And he invites the Stones to a reception, and they accept. And I picture them not paying attention to a story, barely paying attention. Keith Richards in a silk kimono with a martini glass. And he perks up, though, when he hears that the governor had been stage security for their concerts 25 years earlier. And Keith Richards says, let me get this straight. You bodyguarded us in '81, and now you're the governor? And Ventura says, that's right. And Keith Richards, and I'll clean it up here, says, effing great country, mate. And he's not wrong. So anyway, that's what the book is about. Thank you all for listening to my nonsense tonight, and thank you, Michael, for having me. I really appreciate it.